the title of this panel is Challenges Facing the Biopharma Industry. And by design, we're trying to make this a little diverse and try to cover a lot of the things that were not necessarily covered by the previous speakers. I'm very, very pleased to have, in addition to Dr. Spielberg, who is the Senior Advisor at Younger Partners, who was introduced before, very pleased to have Lisa Henderson, who is the Editor-in-Chief of Pharmaceutical Executive. We've known each other for a number of years. I've had a relationship with Pharmaceutical Executive for many years. And full disclosure, I'm a member of the editorial advisory board of Pharmaceutical Executive. And I have a great respect for them, because not only are they the premier C-suite magazine and website and webcast, so forth, but also they have really demonstrated, and we were at an editorial advisory meeting the other day, that they have pivoted in ways to make the brand even more useful and to reflect the changes related to pandemic and so forth. And I have my hat off to you for the fact that you're able to do that. So with this, this is a fireside chat, and I had a session with the two panelists, and we agreed on a couple of questions to ask. They're not going to be in a clear order, other than the order that I wrote them down. But they're ones that where both Lisa and Dr. Spielberg will have an opinion, but from a different angle, because they're they have a different role in the world. I guess the first thing I'd like to ask is, one of the new things that's being debated is this concept of the real world evidence, and that's being discussed very heavily as an alternative or to supplement clinical trials. And this is obviously under discussion with the FDA is thinking about it. So I'd like to either one of you or both of you to comment on whether you think that's going to happen, and if so, what are the issues surrounding that way of trying to get the right evidence versus the traditional clinical trial method.
You want me to start?
Dr. Spielberg, do you want to start?
I'll let Lisa start. That's fine.
Okay, all right.
You haven't had a chance to talk yet.
Okay, all right.
So that's a good question. Real world evidence has come up almost from the beginning of the pandemic, the dialogues around clinical trials and structuring the designs and how to change, how to pivot, the designs during COVID. Obviously, real world evidence was discussed in FDA, and it became a focus and movement in the past couple of years. We're really pushing with some guidance and trying to get companies to move forward with that. But I think that it's become just higher level of discussion. And maybe it goes to what I've heard before and what others have said today is COVID has accelerated things that were already in motion. So if it was in motion, it's moving much, much further. So I've already heard of a couple of pharma companies that have worked towards integrating some of the real world evidence into some of their submissions, because it's helpful and not having to depend, especially when you have what do I want to say? Difficult therapeutic areas, maybe, to try and put some of that data in there. So I'll stop.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Spielberg?
No, I agree. I think the world's changing very, very rapidly, obviously. And I'll fall back onto some anecdotal medical things, since I do medicine or did medicine a lot. Talking to my internal medicine colleagues right now, and it was interesting looking at Doug Long's categories of illnesses. The thing they are seeing most of right now is depression, anxiety, and insomnia. Surprise. Made extremely more acute by the COVID situation. But the management of those things, pharmacologic and otherwise, is changing dramatically. So your background rates of all sorts of things are changing very dramatically in the real world. Folks are relying on cognitive behavioral therapy. Folks are relying on mindful meditation, no copays, few side effects, easily done at home, and begins to supplant both the development of new medicines for those indications, as well as utilization of older medicines for those indications. That's just one very simple example of what's going on. But because of COVID and because of our changes in our lifestyles, how much exercise we're getting, what our diets are like, all sorts of things are changing dramatically. And if you don't superimpose real world data, and we talked about electronic capture of those real world data and how to validate those things going forward, we could be very misled by a small limited study and a small number of people for almost any indication. And, we talked about background rates of placebo. My guess is placebo rate responses are being markedly affected right now by all the overlay of living through as a society what we are with COVID. And that's going to change the way clinical trials look. And it makes it very difficult to rely on historic data, for example, of response rates in the past, even for conditions that we consider objectively measured. So are we going to see more real world data? Yeah. Is it going to require validation? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's can be promising, but has lots of complexities that we're going to have to work through. Oh, one of the terms that both Lisa, you and Dr. Spielberg mentioned when we were chatting in preparation was the whole relationship with the patient is changing. In fact, it was changing before the pandemic. I think maybe that the pandemic has accelerated some things. Could the two of you share your individual thoughts on one, how the relationship with the patient is changing in so many dimensions, including inpatient, outpatient, the collection of data, et cetera. There are a number of variables that come into play, but maybe you can share the couple that you think are worth sharing with the audience in terms of what you think the issues are.
So I go back to what Peter Marks said earlier. I think he said clinical trials are not a burden. He didn't say they were a burden, but he did say that they were, and I have it written down. It's an imposition. So clinical trials are an imposition on individuals. So once you can get to a point where you can design a trial to make it more convenient for a patient. We've talked about patient-centric trials for a long time, and trying to get the patient's view of the trial, getting it to be less than, less burdensome, basically. So that's one aspect when you look at the trials, and that's got a lot going on with that. The wearables, getting the data that way, the diaries that was mentioned earlier. A lot of these things, affect the trials. The other part is is where the patient is going to get their prescription, and this was touched on by Doug, is in the doctor's office, and doctors are, as he mentioned, less hesitant to switch a patient's therapy if they're not in the office, and so what does that mean for patients out there trying to access medicine and access their health, with their physician? Those are just two aspects. There's others.
There are many dimensions. Dr.
Yeah.
Spielberg, your perspective?
Yeah, and again, it's been mentioned before, but all human interactions are reliant on trust and confidence. When I was in medical school in the last millennium, way back when, we talked a lot about the development of a therapeutic relationship between patient and physician. And a lot of that was dependent on trust. It was belief that the physician was acting in the best interest of the patient, and that was their only focus. There were no side issues of cost of medicines or this medicine or that medicine or anything else. It was, I am acting in the best interest of my patient, and my patient believes it. The other aspect of trust right now is what aspects of information do people rely on and believe in, quote unquote. I mean, Peter Marks alluded to it, the very large number of people who don't, quote, believe in vaccines. Those are not people who have cared for children with measles encephalitis or measles pneumonitis, or who had 2 kids in your 5th grade class, as I did, with polio. It's unfortunately, and this isn't going to happen quickly, but science education in our country is often sadly wanting. And people are exposed to social media and other information sources that may or may not be reliable, or may or may not be driven by data and science. And sadly often end up very confused and really trying to struggle with how to put medicine into the context of their lives. And being in clinical trials, it was mentioned by Peter again, that if we're going to understand vaccine effects, you need to study different populations, because different populations are at majorly different risks for disease progression or severity of disease, for a variety of reasons. And those can be economic and social and genetic and all, a mixture of all of those things. And, if unfortunately we've had misadventures from Tuskegee and everything else in the past, which has destroyed trust and taken away confidence of many people that their doctor is acting in their best interest. So we have a lot of work to do to reestablish that trust, to reestablish a belief in science and in data, and how that science and data can actually accomplish things. And most of that has to come from patients who believe it. In my game, you talk to parents of children with cancer who have participated in children's oncology group studies, parents of children with cystic fibrosis who have participated in the development of some of the most effective medicines that I've ever seen in my life for cystic fibrosis. Having me say it, minimal effect. Having the parents and the patients say it has a real effect. And I think we have to reestablish partnerships with our patients, with their families, in reinforcing just how vital clinical studies are to our progress and to their health.
But I think you have a problem generally, which is the relationship of the patient to the healthcare system, doctors. It's really a two-way street. In other words, there's also a requirement that patients themselves do their homework and are educated and so forth. That the burden can't be just on the healthcare provider and so forth. And it's like they say, democracies depend upon the electorate being, putting in the energy and educating themselves. Not the system itself can't create a healthy democracy. Similarly, the patient, doctor, healthcare system requires that patients, they have to put a certain amount of effort in. And unfortunately, that's part of the problem. But I think your point
It's
about,
reestablishing a new partnership and a new definition of relationship. And I'm optimistic we can do it. I mean, I've seen it in
Yeah.
my life with families and patients and foundations who really understand it and are indeed more persuasive than I am as the physician in getting the job done. But it takes a partnership of all of us in order to do it.
and unfortunately, in a system now where doctors can't see patients more than 15 minutes at a time, it makes it a lot harder, right? Economic pressure.
It's trickier.
Turning to another topic, which is, whenever there have been new innovations, but where the science is different in the nature of how you make the drug or how it's distributed or how it's manufactured, what it changes. And you see that, right? If you go back to the original, pharmaceutical products and how they've evolved and how they're made and how they're proved. With this explosion of new sciences, right? Gene therapy, CRISPR, T cells, all these things, they're significantly different than their predecessors in so many different ways. How do you see, and we'll start with Lisa, how do you see these new sciences impacting the whole, biopharma ecosystem in the healthcare system, right? And the drug companies that read your magazine?
Yeah, so I was impressed with Dr. Marks's presentation on the gene therapy. Obviously, we talk a lot about gene therapy, so just factually knowing there's only 5 approved gene therapies currently in the US I knew that, but just to see it on the screen.
He listed them right on the screen there, right?
You know, and I thought, oh my gosh, I thought there was so many more, but that's because they're all in development. These have been going on for a long time. So the challenges, I think, are, exactly what he said is the individualized, it's an individualized therapy, right? So you're looking at smaller populations. You have to find these populations. You have to find these people that usually it's a rare disease, I would think mostly. And then taking into considerations those trials that he had mentioned, this, designing the trials with that smaller population, needing a natural history cohort and that kind of thing. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, of course, is the manufacturing piece. And I think that the companies that are in the space, they are well aware that manufacturing is the quality, and it's the drug, they're one and the same. They can't be separated, but they also can't be scalable. So there's a lot going on with those therapies in regard to that. Separately, the pricing issues are there. They have to be negotiated.
What do you do about a drug that costs $450,000 per patient, right?
Right.
You're dealing with a whole different dimension.
Yeah.
Than something that might be $3,000, right?
Right. And and then it's either curative or it's significant. That slide with that child. How could you even not want to put a price on that? It's just, but that's what you have to talk about in the real world. You have to talk about how these drugs get priced and funded and such, and even the manufacturing is not an insignificant piece of it. So,
yeah, and a different skill set. I think the manufacturing is totally different skill set than what they're used to, right?
Yes, because it's not what the small molecule tablet.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the delivery of it, a lot of times, the Luxturna right on the eye, you're in the office with an injection.
Yeah.
Significant.
Well, certainly not self-administered, right?
Yeah.
Spielberg, your comment?
And subtle. When I was on the USP board, we had this whole long days discussion on glass delamination. What did I know about glass delamination? Zero. But with new excipients and new types of chemicals being put in glass, the importance of pharmaceutical grade glass becomes critical. Otherwise, the glass begins to delaminate into the IV solution, and you end up with particulates and fail compliance. So, I mean, it can be something as, quote, simple as that,
Right.
all the way through, how do you get remarkably complex molecules into a formulation suitable for small volume delivery, as you said, into eye, or even small volume delivery intravenously. I think the perspective, though, and Peter got it. I mean, if you've seen a child with spinal muscular atrophy, you know what a bad disease is. You know what an erstwhile hopeless situation is. When you see something work that well, that is, in my mind, again, having been in the game 45 years, a miracle. Okay. Right. And we're not, we tend to either oversell or undersell. And I think on the undersell side, we really haven't been able to effectively communicate, either from a price benefit point of view or cost benefit point of view, what the value in human life is to some of the new compounds coming down the pike. I mentioned the cystic fibrosis drugs. I mean, that's near and dear to my heart as a pediatrician. But the bottom line is, we now have drugs that 10 years ago we could not have imagined in terms of effectiveness. Truly remarkable effective drugs. And do we therefore have an obligation, now that we have these, to figure out the manufacturing, the pricing, the distribution, and everything else? Yeah, because the basic science, in fact, has evolved more rapidly than have all the pragmatic things that we need to deal with. But we shouldn't forget how amazing some of these medicines are. And I think Peter's example, was there to remind us of that.
Last question that I'm going to ask is truly a big picture question. And I think there's been a lot of discussion about healthcare systems and how they're different around the world. But it's clear that no country says that they feel their system is working well. But certainly in the US, everyone knows that even though we have terrific technology and doctors and so forth, somehow there are things in the healthcare system that aren't working in terms of the right behaviors, but the other is the cost, right? So and the problem of the drug industry is it hasn't done a good job of helping the general population and patients understand how they fit into the economics of the healthcare system. And, to be honest, part of it is because, you go up to the pharmacy and you actually have to shell out your copay or whatever. A lot of things when you go to the hospital, it's hidden, the pricing of these hidden. So you don't know how big the dollars are. So part of it is really not the fault of the drug industry. But the sad part, I think, and I want you to comment on it, is sadly, I think the drug industry, although it's made some of its own mistakes, right, on pricing. The reality is it should be considered a hero in terms of, one, curing or prolonging life, but two, actually contributing to the control of healthcare costs, right? If you prevent a patient from being in the hospital 4 more days, that overwhelms whatever the cost of your drug is. So any comments though on this issue, the healthcare system? What are each of you, maybe the 1 or 2 things that you feel has to be done? And it could be related to the drug industry, or it could just be related in general to healthcare in order to make things better.
So early on, and it's still a topic now, early on, there was discussions among some pharma CEOs and industry that this is the time, with their coming together quickly for COVID, to make a real impact on their perceived negative image, that this could change the way that pharma is viewed by the public, and in a real positive way. And there's no doubt that these companies moved extremely quickly to get some of these collaborations working together to get their drugs into the trials very quickly, and to shift gears and to do that, but on the other hand, there is not a cohesive, like you were saying, Peter, there's just not this cohesive knowledge or this cohesive movement where that people can come together and see those values, that value that pharma brings. I don't know where that starts. It could start with, I think it was USA Today that Dr. Marks had an opinion piece in, about how the safety of the drugs are going in the vaccines, in clinical trials for COVID is a priority, and the science is a priority. And that, I don't know as an industry how they change that. So that's just one aside. They tend not to, point some fingers at the lack of transparency in the healthcare system. So that's an observation, but you're right, Peter, where patients feel it is when they go to the pharmacy, when they're paying a copay and it's astronomically out, not in line with their budget, it's just not what they're thinking of what they can pay or afford. But it's not always the pharma company's fault, and I don't think that's well understood. So
that's right. Dr. Spielberg, you get the last word.
Yes.
The last word. Oh, lots of last words. I was just thinking, I was a sophomore in medical school when Medicare and Medicaid were passed. This is my lifetime. And it's a snippet in the history of my profession.
Mm-hmm.
The Greeks were talking about these things thousands of years ago of medicine. We are babes in the woods in an incredible biologic revolution. Even those of us who have spent our careers in it and read the literature and everything else, there's no way you can keep abreast of things. The conversion of basic science into drugs that actually benefit people has never been as rapid.
Yeah.
And yet the language we have available to us and that we use amongst all of our citizens is inadequate to express that.
Yeah.
So I think as Peter talked about establishing a new playbook, we all need a new playbook.
That's right.
It's industry's responsibility. It's medicine's responsibility. It's nursing's responsibility. It's government's responsibility. It's patient and patient advocates' responsibility. If we don't, we throw out the greatest opportunity humankind has ever had to relieve suffering, to improve the quality of life. We have that possibility. We also have the possibility of losing it if we don't, in fact, develop a new playbook.
Well, one thing's for sure is there's going to be a change after the presidential election. Just none of us knows what it's going to be as far as healthcare in terms of what the story is going to be. But obviously, there's going to be some change. So I want to thank the two of you for a wonderful session. I think we tried to, sort of add some questions that really fit what the two of you feel very comfortable talking about, but also not overlapping that much with the other speakers, which I think we were able to do. And I really want to thank you.